following presentation is for educational purposes only. All of the symbols, trading ideas, and live trading are for demonstrational purposes and are not recommendations or trading advice. Past performance may not be indicative of future results. All of the information and opinions expressed by third-party guests are their own and are not necessarily those of NinjaTrader LLC. Trading futures involve substantial risk and may not be suitable for everyone, and trading futures can result in losses greater than the initial required margin. Traders should only trade futures with risk capital. Risk capital is money that you can afford to lose without jeopardizing your financial security or current lifestyle. You can find additional disclosure information on the NinjaTrader website.
Today on Traders Workshop / Technical Analysis Explained, I'll be your host talking about pivots. Now, we talk about pivots all the time on the intraday charts that we see. We talk about them on bars closing. We talk about them on the opening range and trade setups and all the different segments. And for me, pivots are one of those indications that are so simple, but when I learned of them, it was also an aha moment. You know, you probably had those in your trading where something becomes clear, or you learn something that explains something that you didn't know about, right? And pivots for me was that about intraday trading. Now, it's not, they aren't as useful on some days as others. And that's part of the understanding of what they are. But they are something that can help frame a trading day. And so on a day like today, they might not be as useful because yesterday we had a really rangy day, but they still can be useful, as we'll take a look. So I've got a gold chart up. I'm going to switch back over to the E-mini. And 10-minute chart, the beauty of pivots is if you have a 1-minute chart or a 10-minute chart, it doesn't matter. They'll be based on the same data. So I'll first walk you through applying them to your chart. Very simply, indicators, scroll down, you'll see pivots. You hit add, and here's where I like to set up the pivots, because when we add them, they don't quite fit the need of what I want. So a couple things I want to make sure. One is pivot range is daily. Pivots are based on a higher time frame data set. So when we're looking at intraday charts, well, a higher time frame data set could be daily. That's the most commonly used pivots. And I'll explain why when we look at the history. They can also be weekly or monthly. So that brings up another way we can use pivots, but we'll come back to that as well. The calculation mode. In most markets outside of the futures market, when we're talking about cash FX, we're talking about stocks, we're talking about I said FX, let's say bond pricing. It doesn't really matter if you use intraday data or daily bars. It does matter in the futures because daily bars can be constructed from a settlement price, not the last price traded, which is key to pivots. We need to know what that last price traded is, I think. So I change, if it's not already set there, I make sure it says calculated from intraday data. What does that mean? Well, intraday data is data on an intraday chart. And if we were to look at an intraday chart, it would go back to use the last traded price from the previous day in its calculation. We'll talk about calculation in a moment. Width. This is where I change this. I go to, let's say, 120. You could go 100, 120, but that width is how much width does it take across the chart. The reason why I like that is like to expand it from 20 to, let's say, 120 is it's not just about what's happening now. A width of 20 it's like the last 20 bars of the intraday day. If you're looking at a 1-minute chart, it'd be, let's say, 20 minutes. But no, on a 10-minute chart, I want to look at, pretty much the entire session, because I want to know what happened previously with respect to the pivots and with respect to price. Did it test the pivot or any of the levels? So I make the width wider. Calculate, we talked about this. This is setup. We're not going to worry about setup. Visual, not really worried about. Scale justification, fine. Panel, yes, we want to put it on the same series. Here's the plots. This is where I change the colors. I like to change, again, mine to blue. I do it a little thicker, and I do make them dashed. I just like the dash pivots. Now, R1, R2, R3, those are the top pivots. Those are the pivots that come on top. I like to have them as red because R stands for resistance. And while any line can act as support as resistance, from their placement around the middle point, if they're on top, that's downward pressure, that's bearish, that's red in my mind. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make it a dashed line with a 2 thickness, but it's going to be red. I don't really care. I don't really care to distinguish the R1 from the R2 from the R3. They can be the same color. I don't care. Now you could do a couple of things. You can make the thickness of the lines different. You can make a lighter or darker red or darker color of whatever you use. But I like to just say, okay, you know what? That's a red dotted line. That's a pivot line, and that's above the pivot. And again, I haven't gotten to the calculation yet, kind of on purpose. I want to get these, the way the pivots look, so we can refer to them when we do talk about calculation. Now, green is support. This is S1. That stands for support, and that's green. So if we just walk through this real quick, and it's not so quick because there are a lot of inputs, but if we just walk through this, then we can get the pivots looking the way we want. And when we refer to the pivots in the calculation, you'll be able to see these better. The great thing is I can hit apply and I can make this a template. So let's go to template and save. So I'm going to make, that says pivots default. I can call this my pivots, something like that. And I can make it the default. So now every time I bring up I add a pivot study, it's going to look like this. Now that didn't quite get me. What are we doing? We're doing a 10-minute chart. And let's see. That got me close to the end of, well, that is kind of close to the end of the day right there. So that'll extend the entire length of trading. So what are the pivots? Back in the day, before we had electronic trading, before screens, before computers, really, the only computer people used was a calculator. And even then, back before then, they might have used hand calculators. What we would see is traders would be in their pit, and they'd have the boards with the quotes, maybe electronic, but probably before electronic. Maybe it was all handwritten somehow. And at the end of the trading day, they would look at the markets they were trading. They would write down the high, the low, the close of that day. They would take that information and they would calculate the pivots for the next trading day. Why? Because they wanted to know important levels that they could trade the next day. If the market got a bid and started trading up, then you have a few levels on the upside. If the market went the other way, you had some levels on the downside. So it was kind of like, okay, I don't really know which way the market's going to go, but if I see that it's going one way or the other, I've got areas that I can put orders in to protect myself or take advantage of the trend. So what are we doing? How are these pivots being calculated? Well, the key is the pivot itself, the pivot point. And I'm going to use yesterday's trading as an example to calculate today's pivot. This pivot was known at the close of business yesterday. And this pivot is calculated by taking the high of the day, which here is right here. I'm going to use an arrow. If I can find the arrow, Here it is. There's the high right there. And here's the low right here. And then the close is somewhere in there. It's really tiny, right? Because it happened at 5 o'clock. There's not a lot of trading left in the day, but somewhere there's the closed. So what we're doing is we're taking the high, the low, and the close of the day and averaging it. And you'll notice, of course, that that pivot will be somewhere between yesterday's high and yesterday's low. Has to be, right? Because we're taking an average of 3 values that are between or in one's inside the high and the low. So it can't be higher than the high, it can't be lower than the low, it has to be between. Now, if the close is closer to the low, that pivot will be lower than halfway between the high and the low. If we were to have closed closer to the high, that pivot would have been closer to the high. In this case, yesterday, we closed a little bit off the low. So that pivot is closer to the yesterday's low than to yesterday's high. I don't care. I don't really care. It's more about math, but I just want to know where that pivot is because I know that other traders are looking there and they're going to probably place some orders in there. So we might at least experience some consolidation there. Now, it might not be consolidation. It might be an area of resistance or support. But if we start trending towards the pivot, that's a guide for me. That's like saying, here's the next place we're gonna find. Okay. Doesn't always happen. Past performance, not indicative, future results, etc. But that's the thinking. Now, how do we calculate R1, R2, R3? Well, I'm going to skip R1 and S1. R1, R2, R3, S1, S2, S3. I'm going to skip R1 and S1. I'm going to go right to R2. R2 is simply the pivot that we calculated using yesterday's high and low and close. And it's taking yesterday's trading range from high to low and adding it to the pivot. Very simple. So if I look at the path tool, no, let's use the ruler rather. And I say, okay, you know what? Here's this move. That was, let me see. That's about almost 95 handles. That's going to be the same distance to from the pivot to R2. So let's get that ruler up again. And this is kind of fudging it because it's not grabbing on at the same place, but I would expect around the same value, 94.50. So my old eyes and my, shaky hands was able to get it within a tick. But, I know if I look at these labels, this value from R2 to pivot, if I did the math, would equal the same distance. Let's go to R3. R3, same concept. I take yesterday's range, I add it to R2. There's R3. So yesterday's trading range becomes really important when we're talking about pivots. Yesterday's trading range guides these pivot values. Now, I skipped R1 and S1 because there's a little more math. But what I do know is R1 to S1 is yesterday's trading range. We'll come back to the math on those because I do want to just reiterate. Just like on the top side, we had R2 and R3 were 1 and 2 yesterday ranges from the pivot. It's the same thing. S2 is just simply the pivot minus yesterday's trading range, and S3 is as the pivot minus 2 times yesterday's trading range. S1, S2, S3 are just labels. Today, they're acting, if we approach them, they're acting as support, but like anything, they could turn into resistance. Support becomes resistance, resistance becomes support. Now, the R1 is a calculation. Let's see, how is it? It's something like, I'd have to look it up. It's something like 2 times the high minus the low from previous. And then this is 2 times the low minus the high. It's some calculation like that. When you net it out, you find that this is the distance. R1 to S1 is 1 length of yesterday's trading, one high to low range from yesterday's trading. So we've got the calculations out of the way. Why is this important? Well, on news days, on days where there is news, well, let's come back to that. Average day like today. When I came in, I didn't even see this, right? I saw something like, let me just get rid of those other drawing tools so they don't interfere. You know, you come into the trading day and you see something like this. You're like, where are the pivots? Right? Where are the pivots? My pivots, I didn't put them on my chart. Did somebody take them off? What's happening? Well, it's just because yesterday was so wide that today's trading being so narrow, we don't approach those pivots. Now, eventually we do. We know that. This is up till 10 in the morning, right? We did get, look at that, very next bar, we tested the pivot, right? So they were there. They just didn't show up on our chart. And one way to see where they are is, well, click with your mouse wheel on a bar. If you've applied the study, they'll show up in your window, and those values won't change. Doesn't matter which bar you're on, those 7 pivot values will not change. Once they're on the chart, they are on the chart for good for today. So another way you could do it, scrunch your chart up and keep scrunching until you see the pivots, right? Oh, here's the pivot. Here's S1. Here's R1. We're a fraction of yesterday's trading. We're a fraction of yesterday's trading range. If I go to find S2 and S3 and R2 and R3, you know, at that point of the day, look at that. I mean, I compare, it's almost like a straight line, right? But as we know, we add more data. We've got a little bit of a trend going. You know, this chart can vary your perspective. Now, once we break through a pivot, my question is, where is the next one? Is it reasonable to get to 43.50, 45? Yeah, I think it's reasonable. It's within average trading range distance. But on a day like today, we might not get there. So it's just nice to know where the next one is, because the rest of the market does as well. They might be putting in targets up there. Hey, we get a runner. I want to sell at the pivot, or maybe a tick below, or maybe a tick below that. Or you know what? I want to give myself a little bit of a cushion. Hey, if we're going to the pivot, why can't we wick through it? Maybe I'll put my orders up there. So you see sometimes around a pivot level, there's going to be some trading above it and below it. And it might take time to chew up those orders before it continues its journey. It could have easily just have reflected off there, but that wasn't the case today. The case was we hung out at the pivot for about a half hour before we returned to our upward trend. Now these are daily pivots. You could certainly add another pivot level that pulls in the weekly pivots. And why would you want to do that? I'm trading a 10-minute chart. Why do I care about the weekly pivots? Well, you might care if it's an important level that coincides with another one, or it's an important level on a longer term and the market tends, you know, it stops, right? This could be a weekly pivot. I don't know. 53.26 could be a weekly pivot. Let's find out. So let's go to our pivots study. Let's add it again. Now, adding it again, we're just overlaying. That's not what we want to do. We want to look at our pivot range. We want to change that to weekly. And to distinguish daily from weekly, what we might do, let's just do it for the pivot. Instead of a dash, let's do a dot. Might be subtle, I know, but, and you know what I'm going to do also is I'm going to change the label, take that label off. If I hit apply, where are the weekly pivots? Let's pull this down. They might be way off. Let's see. I can do this. Oh, you know what? Here's what I got to do. It says NA. You know why it says NA? I need more data. I need to pull in more data. So I've got 5 days on this. It's not going to cut it. Let's do 10. So I'm going to load in some more data. Now I've got those pivots, and you can see that they come in at different places, but not too far. Let's blow it up. Let's blow this up a little bit. Here's where the weekly pivot was, 52.97. Look where this market traded, 52.97, 95, 5,300 in that range. Now, I'm not going to say it's because of the weekly pivot, but if you were to hit an area that was a little more resistant or supportive and you don't see it, it might be that weekly pivots are in play, especially on a Friday, because it's the end of the week. These weekly pivots seem to, it'll change Monday. This on Monday's chart, that data will change. Now, if I pull in more data, look what happens. Oh, I don't extend these. That's right. These aren't extending. This is extending 120. I could extend it for the entire week. I probably want to put in like 500 bars, but let's take a look. Let's do that. Let's see if it'll let me do 500. So now I've got, let's see. Well, maybe I need more. Maybe I need more than 500. This weekly pivot extends the entire week. And then next week, next Monday or next Tuesday, I think we might have data Monday night. There might be some trading. I have to check the CME exchange, see what the trading hours are. But when we come back in, this data set, this dotted pivot line will change. So you can do dailies, weeklies. I just want to run through some of the other pivots that we have. I'm going to hide the other ones. So I'm going to go over here to visible and uncheck it. And I'm going to do that the same for the weekly. And let's just take a look. Woodies pivots. So Woodies, one of these older, I shouldn't say older, long time technical analysis users stumbled upon this a method of using pivots. And let me just, so different coloring system here. We're going to hit apply and okay. And what I'll do is I'll extend that. I think the same thing I can do is make the width a little bit more. Okay. So we'll come back to one day. We'll hit the arrow up here. We'll bring in 1 day's worth of data. So pivots, interesting. Same R1, same R2. However, the pivot itself, it puts more focus on the close value. So instead of using an average of the high, the low, and the close, the Woodies pivots doubles up on the close. So it's like a weighted pivot. It weights the close a little bit more. So it's 50% of the calculation, not a third of the calculation. And so that's what we get. We get these pivots here. Other than that, we use them the same way. Okay. And it's R2, R1, S2, S1, S2. So we don't have the full range, but just different calculation there. Those are Woodies pivots. They work the same way. If I break one, I'm looking for the next one. If that level holds, I'm looking for a reflection to the other one, right? If it breaks through a level, I'm looking for the next one. If that level holds as resistance, I'm looking for a return to the previous level. That's Woodies pivots. We have a couple other pivots. I'm just going to show you what they are. We don't have time to go through everything about it. But this one is slightly different. Camarilla pivots. We're going to add these. We're going to remove Woodies pivots. And where's my visible? There it is. We're going to hit apply. And notice something different right away. There are 4 levels of resistance, 4 levels of support. And so these levels are not your standard calculations. They're there's a little bit of Fibonacci to it, but the calculations give us, kind of closer targets that might hold a support resistance a little bit better and give us more to work with in days where there isn't as much rangy trading. So Camarilla pivots are available on the NinjaTrader system. And think of this R4 maybe as the old R3, pretty close to it. This just gives us more trading levels in the smaller trading days. We also have Fibonacci pivots, and I'm running up against time. These segments go way too fast. I don't know if you feel the same way, or maybe you think, oh gosh, when is he going to stop talking? But for us, these go way too fast. Fibonacci pivots, and Camarilla will take off for just a second. And these Fibonacci pivots, I'll try to do the same thing. Extend it a little bit so we can see it for more of the day. Here we go. Boy, I can't really see those pivots at all, but they're there. And they apply, these levels are Fibonacci levels away from the pivot. So imagine yesterday's range. This would be like 20, 38%, 61%, and 100% of yesterday's range. Same thing on the bottom. So we have the pivot, we have the 38%, and 61% are important Fibonacci levels. They lead to the golden ratio. And that's kind of the key to Fibonacci. Those are those levels. And then 100% right here. So these are just different pivots that you can do, but the same idea holds for all of them. If you're wondering why the market might find a little bit of consolidation before it moves to a new level, there might be a pivot level that you're not seeing if you don't have pivots. On days where there's event-making news, a Fed day, a jobless claims day, GDP, inflation numbers, sometimes you'll see these pivot levels not even hold as resistance, and then all of a sudden one does, right? So you'll see it blow through multiple levels and then hang out at the S3 or the R3. If you don't know about pivots, it's mystifying, but I advise for any trader, start using the pivots and see how the market trades around them.
All of the symbols, trading ideas, and live trading are for demonstrational purposes and are not recommendations or trading advice. Past performance may not be indicative of future results. All of the information and opinions expressed by third-party guests are their own and are not necessarily those of NinjaTrader LLC. Trading futures involve substantial risk and may not be suitable for everyone, and trading futures can result in losses greater than the initial required margin. Traders should only trade futures with risk capital. Risk capital is money that you can afford to lose without jeopardizing your financial security or current lifestyle. You can find additional disclosure information on the NinjaTrader website.